into gin. But it's about creating spaces where people can connect in ways that are meaningful for them. They don't have to know that growing food may well be pivotal in their survival in years to come.
Yeah.
Do they? So I suppose that's how I tried to explain it to someone the other day. This is not, I don't need to convert people. I don't need to preach to them, and I don't need to get into uncomfortable conversations about this terrifying reality.
Yeah.
I can help them be the best they can be without having to terrify them.
Yeah.
Create panic.
I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world.
In this episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, let's welcome local UK activist and organizer and agency executive Kathryn Soares, who's nurturing new ways for communities and organizations to come together and make a difference through relationship and deliberative dialogue. Please welcome Kathryn Soares. And I think in the background of all that, I'm really walking on the edge of my capacity to just keep life moving through my system rather than, any way that I might have wanted to hold on in the rest of my adult life as I was so taught to do. So I've got a pretty good practice of staying fluid in life and expanding my capacity as much as possible. But these past few weeks, I've experienced some of my limit to that, and so there's some emotion with that. There's some exhaustion of trying to expand out to include the scale of these new pieces, and there's some resistance to fully feeling a few of them, and that's even more exhausting still. So it's an odd mix of being deeply inspired and motivated and connected, and from time to time just really deeply discouraged, grieving, and resistant.
It's an interesting space we find ourselves living in these days, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It were the best of times, they were the worst of times. Someone once said.
Exactly. And it is exhausting, emotionally, particularly, I think. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a wonder more of us haven't fallen to pieces.
Yeah. Well, in my dreary inner thought world, the response immediately came up, well, there's always 2020. Yeah.
This year should be a good one. 2020 has always meant perfect vision, hasn't it? So this year's
oh, I love it.
The promise is in the name.
You're the first person to have said that.
This is 2020.
I love being awakened to that. Thank you so much.
It doesn't get better than 2020. So,
all right.
Very good. That set us off. If you don't behave, I'm swapping this water for something proper.
Okay, well, you're welcome to. I mean, it's a little early for me, but you go ahead.
Okay, so introducing myself is a curious one because I've never been very good at that. So I just turned 50 within the last couple of weeks, and that feels really liberating. So maybe other people have had similar experiences, but you see old people who are impolite and who say it like it is, and I always admire those people, and I always wonder, why do we wait until we get to an age before we start just calling the bullshit?
Yes.
And I suppose having a 50th birthday made me feel like I'm quite outspoken anyway. Now I'm really outspoken, so I'm probably going to upset folk. But I was always a little bit odd, and I think I shared that story with you before. So when I was in my sort of 11, 12, 13, 14, my family moved across the world from England to Australia. So massive cultural difference between those two countries. And I was always a little bit of a misfit, I suppose. I didn't fit well in England, but I certainly didn't fit particularly well in Australia. And I used to talk with my mother about what my aspirations were as a grown-up, because of course that's a natural conversation for any parent to be having with their children as they go into high school, senior education. And my mum used to say to me, so have you given any thought to this? And I would oscillate. Of course I was an ordinary kid. At times I'd say, well, I want to be a vet, or I think I'm going to join the police force, or I want to study law, or and I'd oscillate across all of those things, but I'd keep coming back to, actually, I want to own a little house on an acre of land where I can be off-grid, where I can meet all of my food requirements, all of my energy requirements. I can keep animals, and when the shit hits the fan, I can close the gate and just walk away from society without feeling any impacts. And of course, as I started saying that more fervently to my mother as a young teenager, she sent me away to have counselling because she thought I was somehow embedded in a cult, or that I was getting this from some external influence. And but that always felt very comfortable for me, that this idea of separating myself from society. So even if I wasn't able to articulate that at a young age, I certainly felt it, and I felt the pain. I'm quite empathetic, I guess. I have a highly developed emotional intelligence, and I feel a great deal. And I struggled a lot as a young woman because I didn't understand what that was. I didn't understand why I would be in circumstances or in company and feel what I was feeling. And I developed anxiety because I'd have physical symptoms that I couldn't identify as coming from outside of myself, which then meant that I was constantly imagining that I was terribly sick. And so I really struggled in my young adulthood with this sensitivity to energy and to people and to situations, and to being able to see the difference between what people were projecting and what was really at the core of them. So I did. Life was a challenge. Life was challenging and got easier and easier the older I got, and the more I read, and the more I met other people who were more like me, and started to understand that the things that I'd identified historically as being problems were probably strengths that would allow me to do some good in the world. I started my career imagining that this was all about science. So if I just understood the science well enough and I practiced the science well enough, I would make a difference. That was what it was. So I dutifully went off to university and I studied environmental sciences and geology and soil chemistry and hydrogeology and river morphology and all kinds of natural sciences. I had a very varied degree. And then I got my first job working in a government agency, which felt very like I had some influence because I could, you know, be informing decision making. And a few years in, realized that that wasn't really where it was at. So could I try something else? And I migrated into policy development and thinking, well, it's all about the policy. We need good policy. We need good legislation. I did that for a little while. Then I thought, no, that's not it either. Maybe it's about enforcement. Maybe I should work in licensing and permitting because it's about making sure people are complying with the rules as they stand. I tried that for a little while and realized that wasn't really where it was at either. And I went back to my roots, still within the same organization, back to research and investigation, scientific investigation of the natural environment. But at a time when the Australian government were slashing budgets for that type of activity drastically, and the only way that I could gather the information I needed in order to make sensible choices around how to manage environments was by working with communities and by practicing what's now known as citizen science, although 20 years ago there was no name for that. It was just a needs be. And through that process, in my arrogance as a government employed scientist who's here to help, I exploited, for want of a better term, the willingness and curiosity of the communities that I worked within to assist me in gathering data and information. And then they started coming back to me and asking questions. And at that point, my whole perception shifted because I started to understand that what makes a difference is giving people access to the information they need in a way they can engage with it to inform their choices and their decisions. And so the last 15, I've worked on some remarkable projects, but the last 15 years in particular are very, my career is almost entirely focused around deliberative dialogue, bringing people together to talk about where are their fears, what are their aspirations, what do they have that they can make best use of, how can they leverage what they have, how can they use what they have to leverage additional support, who can they work with, how do they identify them. So it's been entirely focused around how do we find win-win solutions in challenging situations. And I've been privileged to work with some really wonderful communities on some very challenging issues. And that's everything from at a national scale, talking about food security in Africa in the context of climate change, all the way down to very local processes. How do we as a community reduce our contributions to landfill? So I've been very privileged and worked at a range of scales, and I think now in 12 countries, so across many different cultures. And so I think I'm finally at 50, I'm figuring it out. It's not about the science, it's not about the policy, it's not about policing, it's not about legislation, it's about giving people access to the information they need when they're at a time and in a way that they can take that information in and respond to it.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. And where do you live?
So I live in the middle of England. So I'm in a town called, it's spelt Alcester, Alcester, but locally pronounced Ulster. Often confused with the Northern Ireland Ulster, which was the scene of so many troubles in the IRA heyday. So I'm very close to Stratford upon Avon. It's a very highly modified but largely rural environment. Lots of nature just outside of the town edge. So within a few minutes walk of my home, I can be in woods that feel like they're in the middle of nowhere, or paddling in a river that feels like it's quite far removed. We chose this town, my husband and I, because the first time we ever came to visit, there's a very tangible sense of community.
Mm.
Everybody stops you to talk in the street. If you
Mm.
ask for directions or information, they don't point, they walk with you and chatter along the way. And so you can't, my husband and I laugh because you can't even take the rubbish to the bins in less than 5 minutes. You have to greet at least 4 people on the way. And
Oh, that's great.
but that sense of community was what I'd missed in all the years I lived in Australia, because that's the England that I'd grown up in the 70s. I came back to England 11 years ago because I was desperate for that sense of shared identity and community,
Mm-hmm.
and couldn't find it. It's diminishing and vanishing. People are very distracted and very insular and very competitive. And
Mm-hmm.
So it was something of a revelation to drive into a town one afternoon, get out of the car and find that it does still exist. And we're a town of probably, I think we're about 2,500 households, so maybe 4,000 to 5,000 people, quite
Mm-hmm.
mixed demographic. Some very wealthy and some very challenged economically. No homeless people. Which created a bit of a stir at Christmas, because one of the local young residents decided to make himself homeless and sleep on the street for a week to raise the issue, raise the profile of homelessness and what we as a community could be doing to address that. So yes, we chose it because of that sense of community, because it has a cohesion which is missing in so many other places.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I haven't been with my husband very long, so we met 6 years ago.
Yeah.
Both of us quite grown up, and me particularly quite cynical about love and romance, and had one of those moments that makes you wish you'd paid more attention to all that romantic drivel that
Mm-hmm.
is, because I'd always dismissed all of that. But we did have a very powerful first meeting, and then the early part of our relationship quite tumultuous. We trigger one another a lot. We weren't very good at managing that in our relationship. There were lots of unpleasant arguments and lots of "I'm leaving you," all the while knowing that we couldn't do that. So we're learning to respond to those triggers in much more positive and powerful ways, as more of our personal material is excavated through our expression of the relationship. We're learning to grow into that and to experience fully the things that come up. So that's a really exciting and powerful thing to have in my life. Yeah. And as I said, I have one daughter. So my daughter is 19. She's studying at university and experiencing all the challenges that young people experience. And living in a big city, and I never visit cities if I can avoid it at all. So yes, there's some interesting stuff there as well for me. I had to drive her home yesterday into the city, and the whole time I wanted to just pull the car over and put my hands over my head and pretend I wasn't there. It's all far too overwhelming.
Yeah.
Much more at home in a wide open space, I'm afraid.
Mm-hmm.
What else can I tell you about me?
You know, that's
it. I'm passionate
good.
About people, the planet, and about laughing. I like to laugh a lot.
Okay, good. Are you any clearer now about the imposter thing? And do you have anything, after having introduced yourself and us spending a little focused time together in this way, do you by any chance have something bubbling up that qualifies as something to say about this predicament that we're in globally, as it appears to you at your level, whether that's a community focus or a intimate relationship focus or a global focus? I'm curious if something is starting to emerge that you would like to say from this perspective, this life that you've just described briefly.
I think like so many people who are collapse aware, who are aware of the position we find ourselves in, the reality. I oscillate wildly between extreme grief, not panic. The panic and fear of it has diminished in recent times. But I certainly grieve. I certainly find myself crying often. And then at the other end of that scale, I find myself feeling really inspired by actions and behaviors amongst my peers professionally, within my community, within my own relationship, which not so long ago would have gone unnoticed. So it took a long time to get to that point, but I'm inspired often by simple kindness and action and simple actions that are very human. And I think, sadly, I probably spent a lot of my adult life not being conscious enough of those simple acts of kindness and love and gratitude and sharing. So I think where we are is utterly terrifying. That can't be denied. And whether or not a societal collapse comes about because of the impacts of radically changing climate, or because of the enormous civil unrest which is emerging across countries as this gap between the wealthy and the poor grows ever wider, whatever the source of the collapse is, whatever the trigger is, I think being aware that it's present, that it's breathing down our necks, so to speak, is an opportunity to see a more beautiful world, if only we can look for that. Mm-hmm. And I think up until a few months ago, I would have argued, my husband would have said that to me, and I'd have said, I don't see it. All I see is the ugliness. All I see is the competition. All I see is the fighting, the chest beating, the power plays, the oppression. All I see is but I think when you open your heart and your eyes to the humanity, there's something very beautiful happening too. And that's been, I've always considered myself a bit of a pragmatist, but that's been an eye-opener for me, because I'm seeing light and goodness and hope where I once wouldn't have seen any.
Are there specific groups or associations or I don't know what else to call them?
I suppose one of my observations, Dean, and this has been, I've recently, the last 7 years of my life, I've worked in the community and voluntary sector. So I had a very safe and secure position in government, which insulates you because you've got the security and the pension plan and you know that your job's always going to be there. It's as safe as jobs get. From there, I went to work in consultancy, private company, where you have this decadence and higher salaries and jetting about on aeroplanes and working in the Middle East and then Southeast Asia and then at the other side of Australia and then back again, and very high profile projects and very charismatic people. We were a company that delivered things. We delivered projects that others would never go near. So we solved problems that other companies couldn't solve or weren't interested in solving. Mm-hmm. And they were big issues where they were. So, we were the first, we built and designed and built the first entirely passive wastewater treatment system in the Southern Hemisphere. We solved the red tide problems in Bass Strait that were resulting from a dioxide plant and its discharges that were killing fish and beaches. And we solved it with a potato reactor. So by using chemistry and by understanding first principles of science, we were able to solve it with nature effectively without having to resort to expensive. So I had these two. So I had this experience of the government, then I had this experience of private consultancy, which insulates you in an entirely different way. And in the last 7 years, I've worked in the community and voluntary sector. And my observation when I first started in that role is that when things are plentiful, when people have enough, there's no motivation to share and collaborate, and equally no reason to be combative or competitive. When you reach a situation where people don't have enough, where they start to feel vulnerable, they have two options. They either batten down the hatches, build a tall wall and protect and defend what they have, or they open their doors and their hearts and they share their vulnerabilities and they find others with similar vulnerabilities and they work together to strengthen their position, whatever that looks like. And I think exactly the same thing applies in terms of this collapse awareness. There are these two approaches, aren't there? There are the preppers who want to isolate themselves, get as far away from people as possible, amass as much food, as much ammunition, as much water as they can, and defend that. And then there's the other end of the scale where people are going, it's coming for all of us. Why are we arguing about this? Let's just roll our sleeves up and decide how can we work together and what can we meaningfully do at our level. And that's powerful for me. That's really powerful, because in this community it happens quite naturally, but I'm beginning to see it happen in communities where I work, where that wouldn't have been the norm 3 years ago. And I'm seeing it not in terms of collapse specifically. I've always been very collaborative by my nature. So when my company was in trouble a few years ago and we were having emergency closure meetings, but how would we keep this operation running, I threw open the doors and said, I'm in trouble. Financially, I can't keep the company running. All of you have told me that we're relevant and that we have a place here and that you rely on us. So work with me, help me to do better. And I'm not asking you for your money, but help me to do better. Help me to create more meaning for you in what we do. And so that was the approach I took. And I've noticed that in the organizations that I partner with, more and more of them in the years that I've been working with them have taken that approach. And I like to imagine that I've influenced that. Whereas in the past, their first instinct might have been to have battened down the hatches and become increasingly competitive and combative. In fact, it was distasteful when I first started to watch people behave that way. Now, I don't have that experience as often. More and more organizations are being much more open and transparent and collaborative and partnering. And my hope is that we have sufficient time for communities to do the same thing. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So that by watching, by seeing, by observing, by sharing what's possible, what's been delivered, we can inspire people to be their best selves. And not to resort to the kind of ugliness and violence and self-promoting behavior that we've been led to believe is our natural state, because it isn't.
Let me just take a little...
I'm talking a lot. You must be fed up with me by now.
I'm not. I just actually need a little bit of clarity, if you would, to revisit what I hear you describing as 3 different segments to your career track or your history. In the government work, could you put a job title or 2 on what you did or what agencies you were working with?
So I worked for the it initially was the Water and Rivers Commission in Western Australia. And when I left after 10 years, it was the Department of Environment. And I can't remember what my actual job title was, but I led a team who undertook catchment investigations. So water quality and land use data collection and modelling to assist with making decisions, to assist the government in setting policy and making decisions.
Thank you.
When I was working in consultancy, I was the science and communications manager of Syrinx Environmental, that's SYRINX.
Sorry, SYR?
INX.
INX, thank you.
And they're a niche market environmental consultancy operating out of Western Australia and Tasmania in Australia. They only do innovative projects. So whereas lots of consultancies make their money by hitting a find and replace in a document to generate environmental impact assessment after environmental impact assessment after environmental impact assessment, we never did the same type of project twice. Our leader, our intrepid leader, Kathy Meaney, who built the company herself, has a short attention span, so she was only ever interested if it was something incredibly exciting and interesting and challenging that no one else would do. So we did lots of very innovative, exciting, innovative projects that for the most part had to exist outside of the legislative frameworks, because there was no mechanism for permitting those types of approaches and responses. And these days, I am the Chief Executive Officer of the River Nene Regional Park, which is not an actual park, it's a virtual park. And we look after the natural environment of predominantly Northamptonshire, also in the middle of England. But we do that by building strong partnerships and enabling and seeking, finding shared aspirations, and then seeking funding and managing relationships rather than by actually, we do deliver some on the ground projects, but most of what we do is around holding those relationships.
Would you say the name of that?
So it's River Nene, Nene, Regional Park. We're a community interest company, so we're not charitable. We are profit making, but all the profit must be spent on community outcomes.
And you said river means regional park?
River Nene Regional Park. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's fascinating. I'm trying to think of an organization like what you're describing in the States, this last one. So anyway.
So you must have community and voluntary sector organizations that work around natural environmental management, or who are advocates for nature.
And oh yes, we do. And I'm certain that we have something in the vicinity of what you're describing your organization doing. I just don't know of them, which is this massive, hard to describe how massive that the quantity of things I have no clue about over here, just in the realm we're talking about right now, not to mention the rest of the world. I'm just pausing because you've brought up a number of times now various things that you've become aware of that in earlier times in your life you might not have seen. You might not have known to look in that direction, to see that brief glimmer and what it might mean in the context of the moment. It's creeping up on me just how stunningly much you have to say.
Dean, if I try to explain it, I tried to explain this to someone the other day. So I was motivated this last year to join my local council, which is something I always said I would never do. So I nominated, and I'm now a town councillor in my community, partly because of the community. And I'm an environmental scientist, a sustainability specialist. I have knowledge that's helpful. And I do have aspirations for what might happen, what we should be doing as a community to improve our resilience. But I've learned over the course of my career that if I behave in a parental way and I inform people of what they should be doing and I tell them what they don't know, they will either become, they'll respond. It's the parent-adult-child transaction analysis model.
Yeah.
If I'm parental with them, they will either become the completely relaxed child who just goes along but never really understands why, or they'll become the obstinate teenager who will dig their heels in and fight with me. So I've been part of several initiatives. The most current one is that we've established a repair cafe. So on the 23rd of this month, we have 12 wonderful volunteers who will come along and set themselves up with their tools and invite members of the community to bring items that they own that are broken or malfunctioning, and they will gift their time and their skills to repair those items so that people are not throwing them away or consuming unnecessarily. Now, the motivation of those 12 people who are turning up with their skills and their tools is not about reducing the impact on local landfill or reducing the amount of money that people have to spend because they're buying new vacuum cleaners when their current one probably just needs a service. Their motivation is they're lonely, they have skills, and they want opportunities to connect with other people. Similarly, the people who come through the door are not coming because they want to reduce their consumption footprint or they want to reduce their carbon footprint. They're coming because these items have significance to them and they'd like to continue to enjoy them. People's reasons and motivations for doing something don't have to be the same as mine or yours. But if what they're doing is contributing to a reduction in our overall footprint and our consumption tendencies, it's building relationships and enabling people to know one another, that's resilience. We're building community resilience. It doesn't matter how we build resilience. It doesn't matter what people do. It doesn't matter what their motivation is for turning up. They don't need to know that they're building community resilience. They just need to know that when they come through the door, they're having a great time. Someone's made them a cup of tea. They're getting some coffee. They get their picture frame repaired. It's all great. It's so that we don't have to spend a lot of time convincing people to see the world the way we see it or to understand it the way we understand it. What we have to do is to look for things that already exist and that are making meaningful contributions. And it might not be the best contribution or the most efficient or the most effective. But if it's contributing to a trajectory of change that's in the right direction, that's enough.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't have to, I don't need any of my neighbours to feel the way I feel about where we are as a society and what's coming.
Mm-hmm.
What I want for them is to continue to care and nurture and support one another and make the best of the resources they have and get confident and comfortable with sharing. Physically, emotionally, that's the best thing I can do for my community. So we've got a community allotment now where people meet up and they crap at growing food. I go there, I go twice a year or something, I'm rubbish. But I harvested my potatoes, I shared them, I got to bring someone else's rhubarb home, I turned it into gin. But it's about creating spaces where people can connect in ways that are meaningful for them. They don't have to know that growing food may well be pivotal in their survival in years to come.
Yeah.
Do they? So I suppose that's how I tried to explain it to someone the other day. This is not, I don't need to convert people. I don't need to preach to them, and I don't need to get into uncomfortable conversations about this terrifying reality.
Yeah.
And help them be the best they can be without having to terrify them.
Yeah.
Create panic. So I don't know if that helps. In terms of what you were saying about, there are things I'm noticing and my perspective is shifting, and I'm not always bright and happy. Yesterday I cried a lot, but you do what you can do with what you've got, don't you? Otherwise, if we wait for conditions to be perfect, it's like a decision to have a child. If you waited till you could afford a child, you'd never have a child. If you could wait until you could afford to travel, you'd never travel. You work with what you've got.
Yeah.
And once we're already in collapse and it's that obvious, it's too late to do those fundamental things around building a sense of place and community and shared values. And
I'm just writing myself a couple of notes so I don't forget. You've nudged me in a couple of directions that I'd like to ask you about. So the first one is, I don't know how much you might be watching my YouTube channel, The Poetry of Predicament, but there's a couple of interviews that I've got a while back with a futurist and systems designer named Joe Brewer. And Joe Brewer, I just find him to be a polymath. He's just a man of big heart and really intelligent, and I'm glad he's doing what he's doing. You know, I'm glad there's somebody out there, a number of somebodies out there doing that kind of design work. And in the last conversation with him, I asked him, so what would a person who would like to be involved with bridging into a more beautiful world their heart knows is possible, what would that person be wise to bring with them in terms of their inner preparation? How could they come better equipped to be useful, to be a contribution to that more beautiful world? And he answered really quickly, and he said, there are two things. One is an advanced ability to self-regulate. And I'll describe that in just a second. I'm imagining you know what that is, but for those of my viewers that don't know about that, we'll talk about that in a second. So an advanced ability to self-regulate, and the second item was a psychological flexibility. So we went on in that conversation to flesh those out a little bit more. In subsequent other communications, I've been able to put together more of what he meant by those things. And certainly I have my own particular take on those things as well. I agree with him completely. It's not a complete list, but it is an extraordinarily strong starting point. And with regard to, so you, in an interesting indirect way, you've been describing both of those things. So I'd like to just say a little bit about that and then just see what your reaction is. Is that okay? Okay. So with the self-regulation part, the notion being, again, for those who don't know, what is this self-regulation stuff? If we look at our day-to-day life, we know when we're in decent shape. You know, when someone we love says, "How are you doing?" What they're really asking is, how's that inner state that I know and love that you have inside of you? And when I look inside of myself, I look and see, so how do I know when I say I am doing great? What does that mean inside? That means I've got some space. It means my plate, so to speak, is not so full that I am not able to be present. It means I have the ability, the space to be able to relate to others. I might even have a little bit of sense of humor to draw on. I might have some new and different thoughts and ideas that could pop up from time to time. I might have some pleasant ideas about my next holiday showing up or a poem that I'd like to write. You get the idea. We all know that state in ourselves, and we call it what we do. We describe it the way we do. Then life comes along and has its way with us. And chances are, if we're a human being that I'm aware of, we get knocked off that state of being. We get that dinged, or we get thrown off track from that state of being. And that could be called dysregulation. So if I'm regulated when I'm in the good state or the preferred state, and I get knocked off, that's to be dysregulated. And the idea of self-regulation is developing the skills and capacity to bring myself back. It might take a while, might need some help from others, but the idea is I have at least the willingness and the awareness of what's going on enough to bring myself back some point fairly soon. Self-regulation. I want to just also mention the words co-regulation, because it seemed as this distinction has grown for me, it seems less and less likely that we really do a whole lot of self-regulation alone. Even when we seriously are alone, when we're doing some of the simple breath-oriented or physical body sensation-oriented self-regulation practices, even within that, we are connected with an earth. We're connected with a community. We're connected with our intimate relationships, even with my dog is an incredible ally in my self-regulation and co-regulation. So, excuse me for taking so long, but I just it seems so very important as an element in what I think is most important for both of us. And I wanted to bring that distinction and fill it out a little bit, because it keeps showing up. Either your own history with and a growing skill set with self-regulating, and then what I keep hearing time and time again, particularly in this most recent chapter of your life, I'm hearing that you are co-regulating everywhere you're going. It just seems like that's a part of, perhaps unspoken part of what you are living your life in. So why don't I just stop there? Maybe we'll get to the psychological flexibility part later. Do you have any reflections on what I'm saying?
I think it resonates for me, Dean, what you're saying. And I think, like everybody else, I'm not perfect at self-regulating or co-regulating. I'm probably much better at supporting other people in their self-regulation than I am at doing that for myself. But I'm lucky in that I have people around me that are intuitive or sensitive enough that they'll recognize that. So, and sometimes from unusual quarters, from professional associates or from my dog, as you say, the dog's a very nice reminder of when it's time to lose some of the plates that you're trying to spin, and just, recenter a little bit. So I'm not consciously doing that, but yes, I absolutely watching and supporting other people as they go through that process of self-regulating, of being able to see when they might be, see what they may not be able to see in themselves. And I rely on others to do the same for me. So I guess that's more co-regulation than self-regulation, but I'm certainly better at it than I have been at any other point in my life. I would generally, in years gone by, have got to the point where I was bottoming out and then have just withdrawn from society and curled up in a ball in my bed and been miserable for days and days and days until I got fed up, and then I pull myself together and snap out of it. But yes, it's more in my consciousness than it has been, and definitely, I suppose you'll get a picture, I'm very collaborative by my nature, so I don't tend to identify with self as a primary unit, if you like. It's always a us and a we.
Yeah. This conversation and this kind of picture of your life history, your career history, your preference history in terms of being with other people, to me, it's an extraordinary story, and it teaches me so much by hearing how you tell the story and how you've deployed your attention. So I'm sorry to use weird words like that, but it just, what you put your attention on in your life from very early. You started by describing what you put your attention on as a child, and then brought that forward through the various chapters of your life. And again, what I'm noticing is that it's it's subtle, this story, these elements in the story, and what's been important to you at each step. But what I'm noticing is that it keeps being a remarkable resonance with those thought leaders that we were talking about at the beginning of the call. You know, when I talk to a Joe Brewer or a Michael Dowd or a Lisa Van Susteren, a mental health professional at a policy level in the USA, and on, and I ask them, so what are some of the elements that people can engage with? How can they shift their own being or something that they're doing to be more a contribution to forward movement together? And they might have ideas, and they may lay something out, and it's often quite complicated. And what I'm noticing is that there are core elements from each of those thought leaders in those conversations that are showing up here in the story segments that you're sharing with us. You definitely are answering my question, and you have me more solidly in the camp of being grateful for this conversation, not with any of the doubts that you may have come in the call with at the beginning. To me, just the sharing, the authentic sharing of the chapters of your life, and particularly this most recent one, I'm finding it deeply, deeply motivating. In the same way, with a very, very different flavor than, for instance, what I know of Greta Thunberg's recent and relatively short life history. There are very different motivations, and there's a different kind of beauty in each. And I find myself really drawn to the subtler, the quieter, the more localized, the more intimate sharing, talking to your next door neighbor. I forget, you can have, within just taking out the rubbish, you can have 4 conversations. These keep showing up for me, not just in this conversation, but in many of recent conversations, that these are the locations of true power as we look, how can we reclaim agency and power in the face of potential extinction? I mean, it doesn't get any more high contrast than that. Like daunting and possibly, annihilating. If someone doesn't have the capacity to hold that contrast, it can be devastating. And so we have that devastating, high contrast, daunting way of holding the situation. And then a much subtler, much more livable, graspable, tangible, shareable scale of how one might engage. So let me just stop there and see if that sparks you to say anything.
I think I have a tremendous admiration for young Greta and for the journey that she's been on in the last year. She's a remarkable, truly remarkable young woman. And I know that she's receives a great deal of criticism from the conventional authority. And similarly, I feel a tremendous admiration for the incredible work that Extinction Rebellion have been doing, not only in the UK, but across the world. Mm-hmm. I have not, my husband and I took off one of the weeks when the Extinction Rebellion were most active in the UK and were planning to go down. And I, at the last minute, didn't want to go. And I needed to tune into why that didn't feel comfortable or appropriate for me. I value the work and the efforts that those groups are doing to raise the profile. 2019 will definitely be remembered as the year when everything changed. It did change. They've had Greta and her messages, the school strikes for climate change, Extinction Rebellion, and their endless energy in raising this issue into the public profile has had a tremendous effect. But that doesn't fit comfortably for me. Now, as a young woman, I did lots of protesting, chaining myself to trees in forests that were about to be cut down, and blockading mines, and because that felt like the most powerful thing I can do. But as I aged and through the course of my career and my experiences, I think, as I said to you before, I don't feel the need to convert people or to preach or to have them understand everything that, you hear this all the time in conflict situations. If they knew what I knew, they wouldn't behave this way. If they just only knew what I knew, they wouldn't make those decisions. And that quite simply isn't true, because it's not information in, decision out. That's not replicable. There's a whole bundle of humanness in here that changes that at every instance. So I'm very appreciative of those efforts of people to raise the profile and to stimulate conversation and to get mainstream media talking about these things more openly, having governments, local and national, declaring climate emergencies. That's all very powerful stuff, but not something that resonates for me anymore. What resonates for me now is identifying the networks in and around where I live and exploring ways that I can help them become stronger, regardless of what their aspirations or their activities are. Because for me, fundamental to all of this, dying better, not securing a future, but in order to die better, to be better people, that's about meeting people where they already are. Mm-hmm. And so that's what resonates and what feels meaningful for me. And as you say, I sometimes am quite conflicted, because I think, but I have a voice, I know things, I should be doing more, I should be more active, I should be more outspoken. But that's not what feels most comfortable. What feels comfortable for me is working at my local community. And I'm lucky because I live in a beautiful community, but I get to work in a dozen other communities where I can have some positive influence as well, mm-hmm. just by helping people be better at the things that are important to them, fundamentally build the relationships that we'll all be reliant upon as things become increasingly difficult. Mm-hmm. But this has to be done at two levels, doesn't it? We do need people beating the drum and shouting and making a fuss and demanding attention. But if we do just that, that doesn't work. And if we do just the local work, that's not enough on its own either. So yes. These two things have to be operating as exactly as they are. Hmm. I was just going to say, and once people's eyes are open, they need somewhere to go where they feel safe and where they belong. And for lots of people, that's not about Extinction Rebellion. That's about spaces within their own communities, within their own families, within their own locales, around their areas of interest, be that gardening, sewing, stitching, movie making, whatever that is. They need places, safe places to go to.
Are there any other agencies or even books or even films for that matter, or sources that I'm not thinking of to ask? Are there inspiring examples of nurturing and inviting that kind of local level support that you can think of, that you're inspired by?
You're going to be very disappointed with my answer, because I'm going to say it's everywhere. I can't remember the circumstances. I was at some personal development type 3-day workshop, and the gentleman who was presenting said, if you imagine yourself in a completely darkened room and you have a torch, and you turn on the torch, but all you can see of the completely darkened room is what's in the beam of the flashlight. And so you'll only describe what you can see within the beam of your own flashlight. But if your flashlight was infinite and lit up the whole space, you'd have an entirely different perspective. So you might see a corner, and that would be what you'd identify with, or a flat wall with nothing on it, or maybe there's an image on a wall. And depending on where you shine your flashlight, that's what you'll notice. And so the answer for me is widen your flashlight. Buy a flashlight with a beam that can be made as narrow as you need or as wide as you need, because I think the inspiration can be found everywhere. I very rarely, now my husband and I watch quite a lot of movies. I haven't watched television for a very long time, and I don't engage with popular media at all, so I'm quite rubbish at parties and things because I can't talk about celebrities and pop music. But we watch a lot of movies and we read a lot of books, including a lot of audio books, and it would be rare these days for us to watch anything and not at the end of it go, oh, there's some interesting lessons in there about how communities have responded to such and such a predicament. And in fact, my husband said to me the other day in the car, we stopped the audio book we were listening to at the time and said, you know, I know you weren't a fan of Star Trek, but and I forget which one it was with Captain Jean-Luc Picard, he said, but if you go back to those, he's just shouted from the sofa, Next Generation, if you go back to that series, every time they were engaging with a society that was on the verge of collapse, the lessons, those lessons are really relevant to what we're experiencing now, because the people who survived were the ones who were able to work together and who were able to shift away from fossil fuels and nuclear energy and work more collaboratively towards the future. So I think there probably are a handful of things that have inspired me directly personally, but I would struggle to name them for you now. I think the inspiration is everywhere once your flashlight is aimed in that direction. And I know it's really difficult to get to that point, because for me, becoming collapse aware, everything was very dismal and very grey and very oppressive and very sad. And it took a long time to process those emotions and I'm still not through them. I still have days when that all feels very black and very grey and very heavy and very difficult. Move your flashlight, point it in another direction. The inspiration is absolutely everywhere, I promise.
Mm-hmm. Well, beautifully said. I don't know that I can come up with any other thread to pull on in this conversation that's more valuable than that one right there. Is that the close of our conversation?
I think it probably is.
Yeah. Kathryn, this has been easily the most random and seemingly disjointed and kind of oddly started podcast interview I've ever been a part of. And it's been an absolute delight. There's been what seems like just a willingness to let both the questions and the responses emerge. And I'm left with being so grateful to know you quite a bit better than before. And I'm very inspired by how gracefully you appeared to be just contributing to life in your way, in your community, in your relationship. And I'm crystal clear, as you've made a point of saying, you're not perfect. None of us are. I feel so validated in my own humanity by by how you've responded, and what's most important to you that you've shared with us, with me. Again, I feel validated in my own what matters most. I don't know that it gets a whole lot better than this.
I feel very humbled by your words, but there's a definite truth in that. Maybe that's my gift. Maybe I can help people feel like it's okay to be who they are.
Yeah.
And to do what they can do.
I can think of worse things that you could be doing with your life.
I'm very satisfied with that.
Yeah.
Very
I truly am complete, and I look forward to whenever the next time is we get to have conversation, perhaps even be able to meet sometime in person. That would be a real joy. I'm curious, is there anything that you would like to say to just wrap up this time together?
I think, Dean, I'd just like to thank you, because you and I have been on video calls together several times. And for me, it's always a privilege to share presence with you. You're, I trust you and I admire you enormously, and I think you're doing really good things. I watch your podcasts often. I can't possibly keep up with all of them because you're simply too prolific, but I enjoy all of them when I find the time to do that. So thank you for inviting me, and I apologize about my imposter syndrome. I did trust that this would simply be an unfolding, and it was. So you've made my day, possibly my week. It's been a tough one. So bless you, and bless everybody that watches, really, because we're all just doing the best we can with what we've got.
Indeed. Kathryn, thank you so much.
Thank you. See you soon.
Bye.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue Into the Sea. Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group that we call Safe Circle Calls.